A town's beloved sheriff affair with 17-year-old black teen girl leads to pregnancy and grisly murder. What led a respected sheriff to cross the line, and how did it end in a chilling crime? August 3rd, 2002, in the small sunlit town of Hollow Creek. For the people here, safety was a given, and no one represented that security more than Sheriff James Rowland. Sheriff Rowland was more than just a man in a uniform. He was the rock of Hollow Creek, a father, a husband, and a friend to almost everyone in town. With nearly 25 years in law enforcement, he'd seen everything from minor disputes to storms that required late-night rescues. People admired him, trusted him, even leaned on him when things went wrong. For most, there was no question. Sheriff Rowland was a good man, someone who would never betray the badge he wore so proudly. But sometimes, even in places as quiet as Hollow Creek, things are not as they seem. In the summer of 2002, Sheriff Rowland's life crossed paths with a 17-year-old girl named Lena Mitchell. Lena was a bright, hopeful young woman with dreams of going to college to study law. The daughter of a close friend and fellow deputy, Lena was practically family to the Rowlands, spending weekends at their home and sharing classes with Rowland's own daughter, Emma. For Lena, Sheriff Rowland was more than just the town's protector. He was someone she admired, a role model who showed her what it meant to help others. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Sheriff Rowland would offer Lena advice about her career plans and help her study for her exams. He was a trusted figure, someone who'd watched her grow up and who, by all appearances, wanted to see her succeed. The relationship seemed innocent enough, a respected officer giving guidance to a young woman with ambition. But as the weeks wore on, things began to change. Their conversations grew longer, the meetings more private, until a line was crossed, a line that could never be uncrossed. By fall, the town's trusted sheriff had become involved in a secret relationship with Lena, a relationship hidden behind a mask of mentorship and authority. Lena, young and impressionable, trusted him, believed his reassurances, and kept his secrets. She couldn't see the danger. But soon, that secret would threaten everything she had worked for and unravel the safety the town of Hollow Creek thought it knew. No one in Hollow Creek would have guessed what was happening, and no one knew the darkness that was about to seep into their quiet lives. A secret was growing, one that couldn't stay hidden forever. And soon, the true nature of their protector would be revealed in a way that no one could have anticipated. November 15th, 2002, Hollow Creek awoke to whispers rippling through homes and quiet streets. Lena Mitchell hadn't come home the night before. Her parents, Martha and Deputy Hank Mitchell, called everyone they knew, hoping she might be with a friend or studying late at the library. But no one had seen her. By noon, their concern had deepened into panic, and Deputy Mitchell reported his own daughter as missing. Sheriff Rowland quickly assembled a search team, taking control of the investigation himself. "We'll leave no stone unturned," he reassured Deputy Mitchell, his hand steady on his friend's shoulder, projecting the calm authority everyone in Hollow Creek had come to expect from him. He assured the townspeople that he would work day and night to bring Lena home safely. By evening, half the town was mobilized, scouring fields, streets, and back roads, calling out Lena's name. Yet Rowland seemed to steer the search in circles, directing attention to places he knew would come up empty. People trusted his every suggestion, never thinking to question the sheriff's judgment. Meanwhile, Martha Mitchell clung to her husband, stricken with a mother's intuition that something terrible had happened. But no one dared to speak of it openly. Not in Hollow Creek, and certainly not about Sheriff Rowland, who was not only leading the search, but also offering comfort to those who feared the worst. In everyone's eyes, Rowland was as determined and diligent as ever. The days dragged on without a sign of Lena. Sheriff Rowland continued to show up on the Mitchells' doorstep each evening, sharing updates that, somehow, always led nowhere. But as his reassurances started to sound hollow, some townsfolk began to murmur questions. How could someone just disappear in a town as small as Hollow Creek? Little did they know, the very man searching for Lena was the one hiding the darkest secrets of all. December 2nd, 2002. 2 weeks had passed since Lena's disappearance, and the atmosphere in Hollow Creek had shifted. The hope that once fueled the search was slowly being replaced by fear and suspicion. How could a young girl, one with her whole life ahead of her, vanish without a trace? The townspeople began to gather in small clusters, quietly questioning how a place as safe as Hollow Creek could harbor such darkness. Rumors started to spread, but no one dared to voice them aloud. No one dared to suspect that a person they trusted could be involved. Deputy Hank Mitchell was relentless, haunted by sleepless nights and unanswered questions about his daughter's last moments. His mind raced through every possibility, every person Lena had interacted with. And though he couldn't admit it to himself, a troubling feeling lingered every time he thought of Sheriff Rowland. Hank dismissed it, feeling guilty for even letting such thoughts cross his mind. Sheriff Rowland was his boss, his friend, a man who had stood by him through thick and thin. Surely he couldn't be involved. But then, something odd happened. While going through Lena's belongings one late night, Hank found an old journal tucked beneath her mattress. The journal had always been where Lena kept her thoughts and dreams, nothing unusual for a teenage girl. But as he flipped through its pages, a strange detail caught his eye. A note written hastily, the words smudged and hurried. It read, "Meeting Sheriff R tonight. Hope it goes well." Hank's blood ran cold. Why would his daughter, a 17-year-old girl, be meeting the sheriff in secret? His hands trembled as he read the note again, each word taking on a heavier meaning. He remembered Rowland's constant assurances, his close involvement in the search. Had he been too trusting, too blind to see the truth? The next morning, Hank approached Sheriff Rowland with the journal entry, his face pale and his voice unsteady. Rowland barely flinched. "Hank, you know I was mentoring her," he replied smoothly, his voice laced with feigned concern. "She was just looking for career advice." But even as he spoke, a flicker of something darker crossed his face, a hint of control, of subtle manipulation. Hank felt it, though he couldn't explain why. Still, Hank's doubts were like a seed, growing quietly in the back of his mind. He began watching Rowland more closely, noticing things he hadn't seen before. Rowland's calm seemed too perfect. His willingness to steer the search now felt deliberate. Hank started retracing Lena's steps himself, searching for any overlooked detail, anything that might reveal what had happened to his daughter. As the days continued, Hank's suspicion grew heavier, though he kept it to himself, waiting for a sign, anything, that could confirm his worst fear. But even as he tried to keep his doubts hidden, Sheriff Rowland sensed the growing tension and knew his secret was closer to discovery than ever before. December 10th, 2002. A storm rolled over Hollow Creek, casting a somber haze across the town. With weeks having passed since Lena's disappearance, the once unshakable confidence in Sheriff Rowland was now fractured. Subtle glances, hushed conversations, and quiet doubts hung in the air, all leading back to one question. Was Lena's disappearance truly a mystery, or was something far darker at play? Deputy Hank Mitchell couldn't ignore his growing suspicion any longer. Desperate for answers, he decided to revisit the places Lena had often gone and the few places she might have gone with Rowland. Late at night, armed with only a flashlight, he began searching a rundown cabin on the outskirts of town. A cabin once used as a meeting spot for the sheriff's team during hunting season. What he found inside sent a chill through him. Tucked behind an old, tattered chair was a familiar backpack, Lena's backpack. Hank's heart pounded as he pulled it out, his hands shaking. He unzipped it, revealing Lena's notebook, a worn-out sweater, and a set of keys. There was no reason for her belongings to be here, in a place she'd never gone alone. Realizing the significance of his discovery, Hank struggled with what to do next. Reporting it would mean implicating his boss, his friend, and casting suspicion on the man everyone trusted. But as he stared down at Lena's belongings, his duty as a father took over. He couldn't turn a blind eye, not when the life of his daughter might be at stake. That evening, Hank confronted Roland privately, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I found Lena's things at the old cabin," he said, watching Roland's face closely. For the first time, he saw a flicker of panic in the sheriff's eyes, quickly masked with a calm response. "Hank," Roland said, his voice steady but cold, "you know how kids are. She probably left it there by accident. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment." But Hank wasn't buying it anymore. The once reassuring words of his friend now felt hollow, calculated. He realized painfully that he could no longer trust the man he'd known for years. Roland's calm was unsettling, his explanations too polished, his reactions too controlled. Something was wrong, and Hank knew it. In the days that followed, Hank discreetly shared his concerns with a few trusted colleagues. With the town already on edge, they agreed to proceed carefully, keeping Roland unaware of their suspicions. They needed solid evidence before taking any official action. The community remained unaware of the sheriff's connection to Lena's last known moments, but a silent investigation had begun. Sheriff Roland had always prided himself on his ability to stay one step ahead. But now, for the first time, he was feeling the pressure close in, sensing that the truth he'd fought to bury was slipping beyond his control. As the storm outside settled, the tension in Hollow Creek only grew. And with each passing day, Hank Mitchell was more certain of what he needed to do, even if it meant going head-to-head with the most powerful man in town. December 20th, 2002. Hollow Creek was no longer the peaceful town it had once been. Rumors about Lena's disappearance and the sheriff's involvement were quietly circulating, fueled by whispers among those who'd once held Roland in the highest regard. Yet there was still no concrete proof, only a lingering doubt that gnawed at the edges of the community's trust. Hank Mitchell pressed on, determined to find answers, and with the quiet support of a few officers, he launched his own investigation into Sheriff Roland's movements on the night Lena disappeared. Digging through reports and reviewing security tapes, Hank was hoping to find any small clue that would unravel the mystery, and perhaps clear Roland if his suspicions proved wrong. Then, late one night, a discovery changed everything. A junior officer stumbled upon a critical piece of evidence. She had found a set of phone records showing repeated late-night calls from Sheriff Roland to Lena's number in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. These were calls Roland had never mentioned, made at odd hours, and they painted a troubling picture of a relationship that was far from professional. This discovery jolted Hank and his small group of allies into action. These were no mere coincidences. The pattern was undeniable, and Hank felt sick realizing the implications. The trusted sheriff, the man who had once promised to protect everyone in this town, was hiding something, and the secret appeared to be connected directly to Lena. But Hank knew that these calls alone weren't enough to act on. They needed irrefutable proof, something that could shatter the mask Roland wore before the entire town. The officers decided to keep up appearances, allowing Roland to believe that his authority remained unquestioned. But beneath the surface, the investigation intensified, and every officer involved was on high alert, ready for the moment when they'd find enough to expose the sheriff. Meanwhile, Roland could sense the subtle shift in the way people looked at him. No longer did he see the easy, trusting smiles that had once greeted him. There was an edge in people's eyes, a hesitance that had never been there before. Hollow Creek was beginning to see their sheriff as a man with something to hide. In the days that followed, Hank and his team prepared for what would come next. They knew that to confront Roland without enough evidence would risk both their reputations and their careers. They couldn't afford a single mistake. And all the while, Hollow Creek held its breath, waiting as the tension built and the town's doubts turned slowly to fear. Hank knew time was running out. Roland was bound to realize he was under suspicion, and if he did, there was no telling what lengths he might go to in order to keep his secrets hidden. The safety of everyone involved was now at stake, and the battle to expose the truth had only just begun. December 30th, 2002. As the final days of the year drew near, Hollow Creek was gripped by a tense silence. Most townspeople were unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, but those close to the investigation felt the pressure building. Sheriff Roland's once familiar presence now felt ominous. Hank Mitchell knew they were closer than ever to unraveling the truth. But he also knew they had to tread carefully. One wrong move could drive Roland to take drastic measures. The team's patience finally paid off when they uncovered a grainy surveillance tape from a gas station on the outskirts of town. The footage showed Lena's car pulling in late at night on November 15th, the day she vanished. Just minutes after she parked, Roland's sheriff's car pulled in beside hers. They watched, breath held, as Roland climbed out and approached Lena's vehicle. The two of them spoke, though the camera captured no sound, and within moments, Lena left with Roland in his car, her own vehicle left behind in the lot. This was it, the proof they had needed. Hank's heart twisted as he watched the screen, feeling a deep betrayal from a man he had once trusted. Sheriff Roland had not only withheld information but had lied outright. This wasn't just a case of oversight or poor judgment. It was an intentional cover-up. Now, armed with undeniable evidence, Hank and his team began laying out a plan to confront Roland and bring him to justice. They knew Roland would be watching his every step, so they had to act swiftly. Hank wrestled with a mix of rage and heartbreak as he prepared to confront the sheriff. The betrayal felt personal, a deep wound that cut through years of friendship and loyalty. Meanwhile, Sheriff Roland sensed something closing in on him. His instincts told him he was being watched, that his authority was no longer absolute. As he drove through town that night, Roland felt the weight of every glance, every subtle shift in body language, as if the whole town were silently accusing him. He realized his secret was beginning to slip through his grasp. On New Year's Eve, just before midnight, Hank and his trusted team made their move. They assembled at the sheriff's office, each officer steeling themselves for the confrontation. The air was thick with the gravity of what was about to unfold. This would be the moment of truth for both Roland and the town of Hollow Creek. As Hank entered Roland's office, he felt a mixture of dread and resolve. Roland looked up, his face a careful mask, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew, and Hank knew, that he knew. The moment hung heavy between them, like the calm before a violent storm. "Sheriff," Hank said, his voice hard and unwavering, "we need to talk about Lena." The confrontation had begun, and there would be no turning back. January 1st, 1998. The first day of the new year dawned with a chilling quiet in Hollow Creek. Inside the sheriff's office, Hank and his team stood face to face with Sheriff Roland, the man they had once admired. The weight of what was happening pressed down on the room, but Hank's voice was firm. He was ready to confront Roland with the evidence they had gathered, to expose the truth that had been buried for too long. "Sheriff," Hank said, holding up the surveillance footage, "we found the gas station tape. We know you met with Lena the night she disappeared." Hank's eyes were steady, daring Roland to deny it. Roland's face went pale, but he managed a thin smile, as if still trying to maintain control. "You're grasping at straws, Hank," he replied, his voice a touch unsteady. "I was giving her advice, helping her. You know how she looked up to me." But the calm facade Roland tried to hold was slipping. Hank could see the fear in his eyes, the slight tremble in his hands. Roland could tell they weren't buying his excuses any longer. "James," Hank said quietly, dropping the formalities, "it's over. We know what you did. Just tell us the truth. You owe her that much." The room was silent as Roland's defenses crumbled. His shoulders slumped, his face drawn, and he looked older, as if the weight of his guilt had finally caught up with him. After a long silence, he began to speak, his voice hollow and broken. Roland admitted to meeting Lena in secret that night, under the pretense of offering career guidance. But as the relationship grew more intense, Lena had threatened to tell someone. She'd wanted things to be out in the open, to no longer hide the mentorship that had crossed every boundary. Roland, desperate to maintain his spotless image, knew he couldn't let that happen. In a moment of panic, he made a decision he couldn't take back. As Roland spoke, his words twisted into a dark confession, detailing how he had driven Lena out to a remote area, a place far from town. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he whispered, barely able to meet Hank's eyes. "She was crying, talking about telling her parents. I couldn't let her destroy everything I'd worked for." A heavy silence fell over the room as he described his actions. The officers, horrified, felt a mixture of anger and grief for the girl whose life had been cut short by someone she trusted. Hank stood motionless, trying to reconcile the man he'd known for years with the monster he was seeing now. "You didn't just betray her, James," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion. "You betrayed this town, every single person who trusted you." The confession was over, but the fallout was only beginning. Sheriff Roland, the town's trusted protector, would face justice, and Hollow Creek would never be the same. January 10th, 1998. News of Sheriff Roland's arrest tore through Hollow Creek like wildfire. People who had known him for decades, who'd relied on his protection, felt a mix of betrayal and disbelief. How could someone who'd been the town's pillar of safety and strength commit such a horrifying act? Families kept their children closer. Neighbors who once waved at each other through open windows now shut their blinds. And Hollow Creek, a town that had once felt untouched by darkness, was shaken to its core. Roland's trial was swift and public. The evidence was clear, the confession undeniable. Friends and colleagues packed the courtroom, forced to confront the terrible reality that the man they'd once trusted without question was a killer. Hank Mitchell sat in the front row, steely-eyed, unable to look away as Roland recounted his crimes. Roland's face, once the picture of confidence and authority, now bore only the marks of shame. In the midst of the trial, more details emerged about Roland's manipulation of Lena, his careful grooming that had disguised itself as mentorship. The townspeople listened, horrified, as the full extent of his deceit came to light. Lena had been someone with dreams, a girl on the verge of adulthood, whose life had been stolen in a single selfish moment. Her parents, shattered by the loss, clung to each other in the courtroom, grief etched into every line of their faces. But justice, as swift as it was, couldn't undo what Roland had taken from them. As the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, Roland sat motionless, the full weight of his actions finally sinking in. He was no longer the respected sheriff, he was just another inmate, marked by his betrayal. Hank watched as Roland was led away, shackled and broken, a hollow shell of the man he'd once been. But even with Roland behind bars, Hollow Creek was left to pick up the pieces. For the town, the healing process would be long and uncertain. People looked at each other differently, wondering how they could have missed such darkness hiding in plain sight. New faces joined the sheriff's office, with strict oversight to ensure that power was never again abused in such a devastating way. The town rebuilt its trust cautiously, learning from a betrayal they would never forget. The Mitchells started a foundation in Lena's honor, committed to supporting young women who faced situations of manipulation and abuse. Her memory became a beacon of resilience, a reminder that those who seek to control and harm will ultimately be exposed. In Hollow Creek, people tell Lena's story now, not as a tragedy, but as a warning. They speak of her dreams, her kindness, and her bravery, preserving her memory even as they remind each other to stay vigilant, to question what lies behind even the most trusted of faces. And every year, on the day she disappeared, the townspeople gather at the edge of town to remember her, keeping her spirit alive and pledging to protect one another. Sheriff Rowland's betrayal would be forever seared into the town's history, a scar that would never fade. And as the community grew stronger in the wake of his crime, they carried a single hard-won truth. Trust can be shattered, but resilience can rebuild even the most broken places.